Welcome to episode 322 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the most complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where we discuss this and all of our podcast episodes. This week, we're following up on our discussion from last week, which focused on Cicero's Varro going into the history of the academy and explaining the role of Socrates in allegorically bringing philosophy down from the heavens, and the implications of that direction, along with the direction previously set by Pythagoras, in causing Greek philosophy to move away from the focus on natural science, which had been near the heart of it for many generations previously. Last week, I mentioned the Cosmos series by Carl Sagan and episode 7, Backbone of the Night, in which Carl Sagan goes through this history for us. And I'll repeat that reference because I highly recommend anyone interested in this at all to take a look at his description. It's a much more artistic and eloquent and interesting audio-video presentation of these issues than we can do here on the podcast. It has a dramatic failing, in my point of view, that it doesn't even mention the name of Epicurus. But once you become familiar with the issues that we're talking about, you will see that what Sagan was endorsing was what led to the philosophy of Epicurus. And what Epicurus was doing in developing his theory of knowledge and his rejection of radical skepticism from Socrates and the rejection of the Platonic forms was directly in response to this line of thought inaugurated by Pythagoras, advanced by Socrates and Plato, which led the Greeks away from the study of nature. The text that we brought out last week was centered in section 4 of book 1 of Academic Questions, and we went through several aspects of what Varro said was the significance of Socrates, that he brought philosophy down from the heavens, that he thought that the heavenly bodies were either far out of reach of our knowledge, or that even if we became acquainted with their nature, they had no influence on living well. And he therefore changed the emphasis of his philosophy from the study of nature to the assertion that he knew nothing except the fact that he knew nothing, and that this made him the wisest of men and caused him to focus on what he thought he could do to live well, even though his decisions were not being based on any opinions about the nature of the universe. That's the reason that his discourses were entirely devoted to the praise of virtue and to encouraging all men to the study of virtue, as Varro says, as may be plainly seen in the books of the disciples of Socrates and above all in those of Plato. Now, what we mentioned last week but did not pursue is one of those books of Plato is the Phaedo. And the Phaedo is the book in which Plato relates the discussion that was held on the last day of Socrates' life as he was waiting for the jailer to come in and administer the hemlock. Socrates discussed at that point with his followers who were present why he was not concerned about facing death, why he thought that he was going to a better place, and why he was actually happy about it, because he was convinced that the body and its sensations were actually an obstacle to the understanding of truth, and that Socrates was convinced, due to his theory of recollection and preexistence of the soul, that the soul was itself immortal and that it would survive death and go to a better place, allowing him to understand truth that had always been kept from him due to the distortions of the senses. Nearing the end of that discussion, Socrates throws open what he has said to his students and asks if they have any questions about what he has said. And he does receive some significant challenges, which, of course, he, through Plato, bats away with confidence bordering on arrogance, but which causes Socrates to explain further his position especially in relation to the charge that, well, the soul may be more durable than the body, but just because the soul may be more durable than the body, that doesn't mean the soul is going to last forever. That doesn't mean the soul is immortal. That's the question brought by one of Socrates' followers. And Socrates thinks about the answer to that question. And in explaining how he's going to respond to that question, Socrates launches into what in modern philosophy is often described as Socrates' second sailing or second voyage. And the reason it's summarized in that way is that Socrates goes into a very important discussion of his own past exploration of philosophy. And what Socrates does in explaining his position is he says that he looked into what he could determine about the causes of things. And then he says, quote, then one day I heard a man reading from a book by Anaxagoras that it is the mind that arranges and causes all things. I was pleased with this theory of cause, and it seemed to me to be somehow right that the mind should be the cause of all things. And I thought, if this be so, the mind in arranging things arranges everything and establishes each thing as it is best for it to be. And when he had told me that, he would go on to explain the cause and necessity of it and would tell me the nature of the best and why it is best for the earth to be as it is. For I never imagined that when he said that they were ordered by intelligence, he would introduce any other cause for these things than that it is best for them to be as they are. And then Socrates says, my glorious hope, my friend, was quickly snatched away from me. And as I went on with my reading and I saw that the man made no use of intelligence and did not assign any real causes for the ordering of things, but mentioned as causes air and ether and water, Socrates proceeds with the criticism of simply itemizing the mechanics of the way things work. And he says, but it is most absurd to call things of that sort causes. So it seems to me that most people, when they give the name of cause, are groping in the dark, as it were, and giving it a name that does not belong to it. Now, I would gladly be the pupil of anyone who would teach me the nature of such a cause. But since that was denied me and I was not able to discover it myself or learn of it from anyone else, and since I had given up investigating realities, I decided that I must be careful not to suffer the misfortune which happens to people who look at the sun and watch it during an eclipse. For some of them ruin their eyes unless they look at an image in water or something of the sort. I thought of that danger and I was afraid my soul would be blinded if I looked at things with my eyes and tried to grasp them with any of my senses. So I thought I must have recourse to conceptions and examine in them the truth of realities. And of course, Socrates goes much further than I'm going to quote here today in the opening of this episode. But the bottom line is that it is very, very clear that Socrates pointed away from the study of natural science to the study of the logos, to the study of ideas in themselves. And that's what Plato develops in many of his dialogues into a discussion of what we call today the Platonic forms. It's the basic idea that you are going to find truth in the study of logical constructions as opposed to finding truth through the senses and the observation of the universe. This is where, if you have any lingering concerns that this could actually be the situation, that such a divergence of opinion could actually be taking place, go back to the Cosmos episode and let Carl Sagan walk you through as he goes over to Greece, goes to the island of Samos, talks about the Pythagorean solids, and how all of this unwound to lead Greek philosophy away from the study of science. Now, before we turn to the second part of the Epicurean criticism of Socrates, let's see what Joshua would add to our discussion so far.
Cassius, as I hear you go through all of this and think back on everything that we've encountered as we've gone through all the works of Cicero that we've gone through, as we've branched out from there to explore what were the sources of his ideas, and we see how plainly ludicrous some of these claims are. And the question that I have, and I realize is not one that is easy to answer or easy to answer in a way that we feel good about. The question I have is this: why do people fall for this stuff? What he's saying is abandon your senses. They're lying to you. The environment that you're surrounded in is in such constant flux that it's impossible for you to grasp hold of any real knowledge. And the only hope left to you to really learn anything, to know anything, is to transcend this world with its lies and its illusions and to ascend into a world of perfect clarity and truth. Why do people fall for these ideas? And I'm sure you've got your own ideas for that. One I wanted to bring up today is because it connects with something we talk about a lot, and that is virtue ethics. It's the idea that what are you willing to sacrifice in order to prop up objective morality or absolute morality? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to prop up the notion that virtue is the telos? What are you willing to give away in order to be able to keep hold of those things that make you feel good about yourself, even if they're not true? Because as we've gone through so many works by Cicero on this podcast, we've encountered point after point in which Cicero is putting on a great show of being deeply offended by something that Epicurus has said, because he's talking about pleasure and saying that pleasure is the good, pleasure is the end to which we direct ourselves. And that if you dismiss certain kinds of pleasures, just because other people think that they are base or lowly, you throw everything into confusion because you've lost the very idea of the meaning of the word pleasure. And so many times as we've gone through these works, Cicero has put on a great show of being flabbergasted by what he's hearing from Epicurus. And when you take a close look at this transmission from Socrates through Plato and down to Cicero, you see the claims that are being made there. And you see that the claims do not stand up even to the most superficial level of scrutiny, but that people like Cicero put their faith in them because it makes them feel good about themselves and about the choices they make. It makes them feel like Marcus Regulus returning to imprisonment in Carthage to torture and death, that was not just a great plan, but it was the only honorable thing left for him to do in this life, was to submit to torture and death. And that any system of thought or system of philosophy that didn't hold out that promise, the promise that great sacrifice or great courage would not be rewarded with the name of the good or the name of the telos. Any system that does not put virtue or morality or piety in that top spot is a system that someone like Cicero is going to reject. And it doesn't matter what else is in that system of thought. It doesn't matter that Epicurus is so much better able than Socrates to point to things in nature and use them as evidence in support of his conclusions. And it doesn't matter to someone like Cicero that we think that we can rely on this evidence because we can come back to it again and again. And we can show it to our friends and see what they think of it. And that by a series of observations over time and the accumulation of sensory evidence, that we can strengthen our opinion and our confidence in these matters. And they are willing to throw all of that away, if only to cling on to the life raft of virtue and virtue ethics and morality. And I frequently find this kind of infuriating. It's one of the many reasons I love Joseph Conrad. A paragraph from his author's introduction to The Shadow Line, one of his novels. He says in that introduction, all my moral and intellectual being is penetrated by an invincible conviction that whatever falls under the dominion of our senses must be in nature, and, however exceptional, cannot differ in its essence from all the other effects of the visible and tangible world of which we are a self-conscious part. The world of the living contains enough marvels and mysteries as it is, marvels and mysteries acting upon our emotions and intelligence in ways so inexplicable that it would almost justify the conception of life as an enchanted state. No, he says, I am too firm in my consciousness of the marvelous to be ever fascinated by the mere supernatural, which, take it any way you like, is but a manufactured article, the fabrication of minds insensitive to the intimate delicacies of our relation to the dead and to the living in their countless multitudes, a desecration of our tenderest memories, an outrage on our dignity. And the reason, Cassius, that I return again and again to this passage from Joseph Conrad is he is summoning not just natural philosophy to support his opinion, he is summoning an equal and opposite moral outrage at the Platos and the Socrateses and the Ciceros of the world, at people who would try to convince us that our senses are totally unreliable, people who would try to convince us that there is a sphere of existence and activity above or beyond nature. People who would try to convince us that the small things in this life, like the pleasure, the relationships that we form with other people, that these things are not enough against this potential for either punishment or reward in another life. And as I say, the moral outrage that he's able to summon here in defense of his own position, I think you kind of need that. I think that as we approach these ideas from Socrates, you kind of need the ability to say, look, this is a matter of everything I love against everything I hate. In the love category is pleasure and is exploration and the study of the world that we live in, and making those connections between disparate phenomena in that world, and using all of that to come to a better understanding and a higher synthesis of knowledge. And in the hate category is obscurantism and the absurdities of the charlatans who are trying to sell you something that you cannot have confidence in. And what they're trying to sell you is the idea that you really cannot have confidence in anything. You can't have confidence in your senses. You cannot have confidence that what you are experiencing in nature has any relationship with any kind of fact or truth independent of your existence. And that really the only way to achieve any level of confidence is to leave everyone else behind in the cave and ascend up into the world of pure being. And it takes, I think, a kind of moral outrage, moral indignity of the kind that we see here in Joseph Conrad to meet those allegations, while at the same time being aware that there are people who are never going to come around because of what Torquatus calls the glamour of a name. He says, those who place the chief good in virtue alone are beguiled by the glamour of a name and do not understand the true demands of nature. If they will consent to listen to Epicurus, they will be delivered from the grossest error. Your school, he says, dilates on the transcendent beauty of the virtues, but were they not productive of pleasure, who would deem them either praiseworthy or desirable? We esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. The art of navigation is commended for its practical and not its scientific value, because it conveys the rules for sailing a ship with success. So also wisdom, which must be considered as the art of living, if it effected no result, would not be desired. But as it is desired because it is the artificer that procures and produces pleasure. Interesting to note in this passage from Torquatus in Cicero's On Ends, what it says there about natural philosophy. We esteem the art of medicine not for its interest as a science, but for its conduciveness to health. It's because these things are useful to us, largely, that we're interested in studying them. But the greatest use of all, from Epicurus's point of view, is that this is how we rid ourselves of the fears and terrors that people have cultivated in us since we were children. We have to study nature in order to get to know the causes of things. And in what you quoted there, Cassius, Socrates is trying to look for the causes of things as well, but he hears the idea that all causes proceed from the mind, and he becomes totally in love with that idea. And he's ready to completely cast aside nature as being of any utility or any interest in the conversation. So there's a lot of threads to keep in hand as we go through this. But at that point, which is that there are some people who are so beguiled by the glamour of the name of virtue, they are not going to be willing to abandon this system, the system of Socrates and Plato, if it means also abandoning the virtue ethics that makes them feel good about what they do and about the lives they built for themselves. and if it makes them think for a moment that pleasure is a more worthwhile pursuit than virtue. They are not going to be willing to abandon the system of Socrates and Plato.
Yeah, Joshua, let's pursue this line of thought. We may even spend the whole episode talking about this because it's so extremely important. Because I think you're exactly correct in focusing on the importance of taking a position, certain things being good and certain things being bad. Now, you've talked about the reasons why people cling to virtue ethics, regardless of the implications of how it means that you're going to walk away from the senses and walk away from the study of nature. Now, in Carl Sagan's episode 7 of Cosmos, he focuses on the reason being that this kind of attitude can come from wanting to justify your position within society. He points out that the Greece of this time period was largely a slave society, and there were great inequities in society, and that finding things to be ordered by a divine will justifies these inequities and lends divine sanction to things that are clearly controversial in nature. That's going on with Cicero as well in his own attempts to justify what he saw as the virtues that had made Rome great and to respond to criticisms that he saw being raised from the Epicurean point of view. So clearly, the desire to justify your own personal preferences is a significant part of motivation behind something like this. But rather than going so far in the direction of diagnosing a psychology, it seems to me we're probably going to be more productive if we focus on how this comes about. And it's that part that you spent a lot of time focusing on as well in discussing this issue of whether the universe is knowable or not. That's the thread that Carl Sagan traces when he goes from Thales to Anaximander to Theodorus to Empedocles to Democritus to Anaxagoras, that despite disagreements among them, they were largely committed to the idea that it is possible through the study of nature to come to some conclusions about the way the universe really operates. We can sometimes tend to overlook that today, but that divide exists even among those people who are not overtly trying to justify their own positions. We've all run into people who, for whatever reason, have come to the conclusion that attempting to find any kind of truth whatsoever is doomed to failure, that it is simply impossible to know anything, that the world, especially today with the bombardment of different information technologies that we have, that the world is just totally unknowable because there's so much conflict, so much difference of opinion. In fact, that's an argument that Cicero uses to justify his own skepticism by pointing out that everybody has a different opinion about these things. And if everybody has a different opinion, how can anybody hope to ever come to a conclusion about anything? And on that score, that's what Varro was referring to in section 4, when he said that the successors of Socrates, the successors of Plato, whether it was the Peripatetics through Aristotle or the direct followers through Speusippus, that both of those schools began to arrange a certain definite system of teaching, which abandoned the Socratic plan of doubting on every subject and of discussing everything without ever venturing on the assertion of a positive opinion. And that as a result, there arose what Socrates would have been very far from approving of himself, what Socrates would have rejected, that of a methodical arrangement of positions on a variety of subjects. The direction that Socrates had been going in was that nothing can be decided positively at all, that all you can do is ask questions. And that's the mentality that I was describing a few minutes ago. Sometimes it's not motivated necessarily by what I would call maliciousness or intent to deceive. Sometimes it's just pure frustration and exasperation and failure after failure of being able to come to a conclusion in your own mind about anything. And I believe it's that as much as anything else that is at the essence of what Epicurean philosophy was all about. Plato himself was pulling back from not taking positive positions by going off into this discussion of ideal forms and saying that we may not be able to get to positive positions through the senses, but at least we can come to some certainty through these ideal forms. Aristotle went in a different direction and did provide some credence to the senses and came up with this idea that there are essences within things that will allow us to make conclusions about certain things. The Stoics went in the direction of following their ideas about pure logic and divine fire and used that as a basis for taking the position that their virtue ethics was correct. But all of them, as Varro is pointing out here, are essentially deviating from Socrates' radical skepticism because they were taking certain positive positions about things. And so when Epicurus comes along, he also is going to reject the idea that we should doubt everything and never take a position. But Epicurus is going to find the answer to the problem of knowledge in the senses, in the feelings of pleasure and pain, and in the anticipations. Epicurus is going to totally reject this idea of recollection and past lives that Socrates and Plato had suggested. Epicurus is going to totally reject the prime mover argument from Aristotle. Epicurus is going to totally reject the intelligent design model, the divine fire model that the Stoics were suggesting. And Epicurus is going to say that knowledge of the universe is possible, but it is through the study of natural science. And when you pursue that, you can come to important conclusions about the nature of your life. You can come to the conclusion that you have but one life to live. You can come to the conclusion that you're not going to spend an eternity in hell or heaven, depending on your actions, but that you are like all other animals in nature providing guidance through pleasure and pain as to how to live. You come to the conclusion that an expansive understanding of pleasure as being actions consistent with nature are the right way to pursue your life. But you're not going to be able to understand what that means unless you first take a position about basic aspects of the universe. Everybody uses the word happiness, but everybody seems to have a different conception of what happiness is. How can you even communicate or think or come to any conclusions about anything unless you first have some clarity about what you're talking about? That's where the discussion about frankness in Epicurean philosophy comes in, because clarity of position, being willing to take a position about something, is what Epicurus is really focusing on. He's rejecting Socratic skepticism and saying that there is a basis for positive conclusions and that these positive conclusions will lead you along the path of living your life in the best way possible. So on those points, as we've discussed it so far, I do think clearly Carl Sagan is right that the desire to perpetuate a political system is at the root of many people who are willing to just latch on to a system of virtue ethics without any deeper thought about its foundations at all. But there's also a group of people who, through no malicious intent, fail to understand how to arrive at confidence in knowledge. So we've now talked extensively about the Socratic rejection of the study of natural science and the importance of that and all of the disaster that it has led to in Western civilization and Western philosophy. But that's not all of the Epicurean criticism of Socrates, because what is also well known is exemplified by an article written by a man named Mark Riley under the title The Epicurean Criticism of Socrates. And he approaches the problem not as one entirely focused on natural science, but as on issues of character and the relationship of a teacher to his students. Riley notes that there were essentially three lines of attack on Socrates in the ancient world. One of them being the leading men of Athens who considered his views to be anti-democratic, which we can certainly see through Plato's Republic and the ideal society that Socrates discusses there. There was also a biographical attack on Socrates associated with a man named Aristoxenus, that Socrates was seething with hatred and malignity, and that he was extremely lustful and did no harm because he confined himself to married women and prostitutes, and he was quick to anger. And there are a number of other personal attacks. But then the third of the attacks on Socrates is that of the Epicureans, which Riley describes as being based on a fundamental difference of opinion concerning the role of the philosopher and his behavior towards his students. Much of what we know about this is because of what was preserved in Plutarch's responses to Colotus. And it derives from the fact that Epicureans considered the philosopher who was professing wisdom to be someone who could bring salvation from the problems of life. And that when you consider Socrates' example, that a philosopher is not a doctor assisting in the eradication of a mental disease, but is in fact someone who is detached and who's simply asking questions and never giving any answers, that this is a dramatic contrast in approach. An Epicurean is going to assist other people by clearly telling them information that is going to be of benefit to them. The Epicurean is not going to simply lead people around in circles asking questions without ever telling them what the answer is. And Riley says that the Epicurean opposition was to the character and methods of Socrates. Colotes is recorded to have asked why Socrates puts food into his mouth instead of into his ear, and why he eats food instead of grass, and that Socrates' words were that of a charlatan or an impostor, because he said one thing in the statements that are preserved in the dialogues, but what he did in his own real life was different than what he advocated. And Socrates says that it is idle to regard horses as being horses and men men. What appears to be a horse may or may not actually be a horse. The sense of impression has nothing to do with reality. And that, of course, is the very opposite of the Epicurean position. Colotes points out that Socrates does not admit the reality of the world around us. He should logically not distinguish between grass versus any other kind of food. And of course, at this point in the discussion, it occurs to me to remember that we have not recently been talking about Book 4 of Lucretius, but in that section where Lucretius is talking about the person who asserts that nothing can be known is admitting that he knows nothing. And that section, which continues on into how the senses are the ultimate test of knowledge, that's all directly aimed at these arguments of Socrates and Plato about the nature of knowledge. We are not going to spend the time to go through the Phaedo in detail, but in that book and in others, Socrates states that the true philosopher tries to get away from the body and turn to the soul, and the true philosopher regards the senses as inaccurate and indistinct, and sees the soul as deceived by the body in any investigation of truth. This is around Phaedo 66a. So that's the criticism in terms of Socrates being inconsistent between his assertions and the actual practice of his life. The Epicureans also criticize Socrates for asserting that he does not even know himself. This comes in the Phaedrus around section 230. Socrates can see men all around him, and yet he insists that he does not know what he himself is. He takes pride in this ignorance, and that's a personal quality that puts Socrates outside the company of truly wise men. Boasting of one's ignorance is the mark of a traditional Greek villain, a dissembler whose actions are rejected by Epicurus. These criticisms are also preserved in Philodemus, who calls Socrates a hypocrite who claims to be less than he really is. It's a character trait that Philodemus goes into relatively at length, that such a person does not say what he thinks, but in fact praises what he criticizes elsewhere. He belittles himself and those like him. For example, if anyone praises him and asks him to speak, a person like Socrates will reply, "What do I know except that I know nothing?" Or "What reputation do I have?" So Philodemus is criticizing this as being a type of impostor who conceals what he thinks. That's the opposite of being clear and frank in discussing of what you think to be true. Plutarch tries to defend Socrates in saying that he's simply being sincere, that he really doesn't know anything at all. But if that's the case, it simply means that Socrates is not a philosopher from the Epicurean point of view, and that takes him out of the arena of those who should be listened to. And so Riley reports that Philodemus says that the philosopher from the Epicurean point of view is in charge of a group of students who are in preparation, and the philosopher is going to heal them of mental diseases and error just as a doctor heals bodily disease. To promote this kind of treatment, the wise philosopher should, quote, "without any equivocation, show to the person in his charge his mistakes." That's this frankness we're talking about, but not to do it out of any concern of arrogance or showing that you're smarter than the other person, but is to help those who are under his guidance in any way possible. And from this point of view, Philodemus says, quote, it follows by necessity that acting or thinking secretively is the most unfriendly of acts. The one who does not bring everything out into the open will be hiding these from his friends. That's an aspect of this that needs to be considered in just the general concept of friendship. If you are someone's friend, you're trying to help them. You're trying to give them information that you believe to be true because it will help them. You're not lording over these other people by emphasizing through irony and hiding the ball that they should have to reason things out entirely by themselves when you have the ability to help them get out of their dilemma more quickly. As we've been discussing already, some are not able at all, despite all the effort they put into philosophy and the search for knowledge, to come to the information that they need to live better lives. And the Epicurean is going to be like Lucretius, who talks about those who are wandering with hearts in darkness. You're going to want to help those people, bring them the information that they need, and not just keep them spinning around in circles by asking questions and professing that there are no answers. So let me bring what I'm saying there to a conclusion by wrapping it up into this, that even though Epicurus disagreed with Aristotle in certain aspects of his conclusions, even though Epicurus disagreed with the Stoics in many aspects of their conclusions, Epicurus was at least in agreement with Aristotle and the Stoics that it is important to say what you mean and mean what you say. If you believe something to be true, it's important to put it out there and assist those who need that information and not just act like no conclusions are possible. That, in fact, is the worst possible approach to those who are really seeking a better way of life, relief from anxiety, relief from disease, relief from false fears about going to hell or being punished by gods. Yes, the Epicureans rejected the Socratic Platonic abandonment of the study of natural science, but at an even deeper level, and really for the same reason, the Epicureans were rejecting the Socratic and Pythagorean tendency and direction towards mysticism, which allows you to take the position that Joshua has brought up earlier, that it is acceptable to just jump straight to virtue ethics without ever explaining a basis and a foundation and an argument in support of why that virtue ethic is correct. We've talked numbers of times about Lucian's Hermotimus dialogue, and that is the point that Lucian raises there. It is essential at the very beginning of an analysis to make sure that you understand and agree with the premises of the argument. Once you accept premises that are false, once you accept arguments that there is a true reality outside of this one, once you first start down the road laid by false premises, logical consistency pulls you out like a undertow into the ocean. It becomes impossible through logic to escape the errors of your first fundamental error. And when you start out with a presumption that no knowledge is possible and that we can, in fact, legitimately go straight to virtue ethics, you're already lost at that point. You have denied yourself the ability to return to reality. Just as Epicurus says in his principal doctrines, once you abandon the senses, you have abandoned and lost your ability to determine the difference between truth and falsity.
Well, about the disconnect between the advice given and the behavior we see in the philosopher. There's an excellent story relating to Diogenes the Cynic, and I'm reading from a website, Philosophy Now, a magazine of ideas. And the author writes about Aristippus, who's the main focus of this article. Aristippus loved to puncture people's pretensions. One day he was at the baths with Diogenes the Cynic, whom Cicero described as, quote, notorious for the most frantic excesses of moroseness and self-denial, end quote. This was the man whom Alexander the Great visited and invited him, quote, ask of me what you want, end quote. And from Diogenes he received the curt reply, stand out of my light. Aristippus left the baths first and took Diogenes's old cloak, leaving behind his own expensive purple one. A purple robe was regarded as elegant by Athenian society. When Diogenes discovered what had happened, he went running naked after Aristippus, demanding his old cloak back. Aristippus chided him for being so concerned about his reputation that he would rather go cold than be seen wearing purple. And I hope everyone sees the point of this, which is that Diogenes is so wrapped up in his own self-image as I live in a wine jar or I live in a giant tub in the street. I live like a dog in a kennel. And my cloak, my worn, tattered, disgusting old cloak, is part of this image. And if people see me walking around in Tyrian purple, they're going to think that I suddenly think that I'm royalty and that he's more concerned about how he comes across to the very people that he himself is often chiding for their own self-involvement. I mean, Diogenes is walking through the streets with a lamp, and when asked about it, he says he's looking for a true Athenian or a real man. He's looking for someone who isn't wrapped up in their delusions. And yet we see here in this little anecdote that he's really no different from the people he's criticizing. In fact, he's worse. In fact, he is more ridiculous and more absurd in protecting his reputation as a dog than these other people are in building their own lives as humans. So, as I said, I think that's a great story. It really captures something in some of what was circulating in Greece in Epicurus's lifetime, with these people putting on a great show. But really, when you pull the veil back, you just see how silly what they're trying to do really is. I mean, if you read Book 6 of Plato's Republic, his goal is not to point out that the interlocutor doesn't know. His goal is to reach the conclusion that we live in a world of constant change, a world of becoming, and that what we need to do, this is not like an option. This is the purpose of philosophy. This is a reason that we are endowed with a critical thinking faculty in the first place. What we have to do is learn to transcend the world of mere becoming and rise up into the world of pure and perfect being, where things don't change, where this Heraclitean physics of constant flux, where that is no longer the ruling principle. And in order to do this, we have to use geometry to get there. And once we've gotten there, we have to come back down and we have to use what we've learned to instruct the people around us and to take leadership roles in this imagined republic, because the person who has left the cave and come back into it sees 10,000 times better than the person who's never left the cave. So it's very much not, let's all gather around and question our own perceived knowledge. It's we're working towards this set of conclusions. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to reach those conclusions specifically. Why else would Plato put over the door of the academy, let none ignorant of geometry enter here? This is the whole point you're here.
So what we've discussed today has been understanding why Socrates was so controversial among the ancient Epicureans. We're going to continue to discuss these issues in coming weeks, because it is so embedded into the fabric of current ideas about Socrates and Plato and philosophy that the Socratic method is a good thing, that we are simply using it as a technique of making people think so that they will understand things better. But in the end, this all originated because, as Carl Sagan said, Plato, Socrates, they had agendas of their own. And the ultimate purpose of abandoning natural science, of arguing that truth comes through dialectic rather than through the study of nature, is to undermine confidence in the senses so that you will not attempt to study nature yourself and come to your own conclusions. You will end up relying on the arguments of the Platonists, the Socratics, and those who say that the individual has no ability to learn these things for themselves, that it is this otherworldliness of forms, ideas, or religion, which is where the ultimate truth resides and not in this world. We'll continue to discuss these issues in coming weeks. Thanks for your time today. Be sure to drop by our forum and let us know if you have any comments or questions on these discussions. We'll be back again soon. See you then. Bye.